In the summer of 2019, a team of archaeologists working near Fairbanks, Alaska, made a discovery that stopped them cold. Beneath a collapsed permafrost bank along the Tanana River, sealed inside ice that had not thawed since the 1930s, they found a wooden crate. Inside that crate were 20 objects. Not gold nuggets, not weapons, not anything glamorous. They were the ordinary tools of survival from the darkest economic collapse in American history. A hand-operated grain mill, a seed envelope wrapped in oilcloth, a cast-iron skillet still coated in a thin film of rendered lard. Objects that a desperate family had packed with the specific intention of starting over, somewhere far enough from the breadlines and the bank failures and the shame. Somewhere like Alaska, where a man with nothing but his hands might still carve out something worth living for. The researcher who opened that crate, Dr. Margaret Hollis of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, later wrote that she wept, not because the objects were rare, because they were not. Because she recognized every single one of them from stories her own grandmother had told her. These were the tools of ordinary American survival. And for a few years in the 1930s, ordinary American survival was the hardest thing in the world. Before we count down all 20 objects, I want you to subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss the rest of this series. Number 20 will surprise you, but number 1 will change the way you think about what it means to truly start over. Number 20. A pair of leather work gloves with the initials RH burned into the cuff. They sound simple, almost too simple to mention. But those two letters tell a story that researchers spent months reconstructing. Records from the Alaska Rural Rehabilitation Corporation, a New Deal agency that helped relocate destitute families to homestead land in the Matanuska Valley, showed a listing for one Raymond Holbrook, age 34, originally of Elmore County, Alabama. He had been a cotton farmer. In 1932, he lost his land when the bank called in a loan he could not repay. By 1934, he was in a government camp in California picking stone fruit for 30 cents a day. By 1935, he had applied for relocation to Alaska, one of 200 families selected from nearly 14,000 applicants. The leather on those gloves was calloused from the inside, shaped by a man who wore them every single day. Leather gloves were not cheap in 1935. A decent pair cost nearly a full day's wages for a field laborer. The fact that Raymond Holbrook packed his gloves, initialed them, and sealed them in a crate meant he was not planning to leave them behind. He was planning to work. And in Alaska in 1935, work was the only currency that mattered. Number 19. A small glass jar sealed with beeswax containing what laboratory analysis later identified as wild yeast culture. People who have never baked bread from scratch tend to assume yeast comes in little paper packets from the grocery store. In the 1930s, grocery stores in rural America were going out of business at a rate of dozens per week. A woman who could maintain a living yeast culture, feeding it scraps of flour and water, keeping it warm near the stove, had the ability to produce bread as long as she had grain. That jar represented years of cultivation. The woman who packed it, whoever she was, understood that bread was not a comfort. Bread was survival. Without leavened bread, you could still eat flat cakes and gruel, but you burned through your grain stores faster, you felt less full, and you worked harder to feel the same. A living yeast culture was living capital. You do not throw away living capital when you move across the continent. Number 18. A hand-forged fishhook set. 27 hooks of varying sizes wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas. Alaska in the 1930s was, for many relocated families, an overwhelming and terrifying landscape. Most of the Matanuska colonists had never seen mountains. They had certainly never fished glacially fed rivers for king salmon. But fish was protein, and protein was survival. And the hooks in that canvas roll represented an entire philosophy. I do not know what this new place holds, but I will learn how to take from it what I need. Subsistence fishing in Alaska during the Depression years kept entire communities alive through winters that made any hardship the lower 48 had thrown at these families seem mild by comparison. The hooks were bent slightly from use before they were packed, which means they had already caught fish, somewhere, before Alaska, before the ice. Number 17. A leather-bound notebook containing hand-copied recipes for preserving food without refrigeration. 43 recipes, vinegar brines, salt rubs, lard seals for cooked meat stored in crocks, ash preservation for eggs, smoke formulas for salmon and venison. Every recipe written in 2 different hands, meaning it was a collaborative document, built over time, by at least 2 people who understood that the knowledge of how to keep food safe without electricity was not trivial knowledge. It was the difference between eating in February and starving in February. Modern readers sometimes look at Depression-era food preservation as quaint or rustic. It was neither. It was applied chemistry under conditions of absolute scarcity. A mistake in your brine ratio did not mean a batch of bad pickles. It meant botulism. The people who wrote that notebook knew exactly what they were doing and knew exactly why it mattered. Number 16. A set of 4 cast iron muffin tins, nested together and wrapped in burlap. Cast iron is heavy. Moving it is a commitment. When a family in 1935 chose to pack 4 muffin tins and carry them from Alabama or Oklahoma or Minnesota all the way to Alaska, they were making a statement about the kind of life they intended to build. Not a subsistence life. Not a survival-only life. A life with muffins. A life with Sunday breakfasts. A life with enough abundance to cook something that was not strictly necessary for caloric survival. This is the thing that Depression histories sometimes miss. People did not stop wanting beauty and ritual and the small dignities of normal life just because they were poor. They carried those dignities with them at enormous cost, in heavy iron, all the way to the edge of the continent. Number 15. A hand-cranked grain mill, small enough to clamp to a table edge, capable of grinding wheat, corn, or dried beans into flour or meal. This is one of the most significant objects in the crate, and we will come back to it. For now, a family with a grain mill and a supply of whole grain is a family that cannot be starved by the collapse of commercial flour distribution. Whole grains store for years. Milled flour goes rancid in weeks. The mill is the difference between a 3-week food supply and a 3-year food supply. In the early 1930s, rural Americans who still had mills ate while their neighbors did not. Number 14. A glass syringe with a rubber bulb and a set of metal tips used for making sausage casings. This sounds obscure until you understand the protein economy of a homestead. When you slaughter a hog, or a moose, or a bear in Alaska, you use everything. You render the fat for lard and soap, you cure the hams, you smoke the shoulders, and you take every scrap of trim meat, every piece too tough or too irregular for anything else, mix it with salt and spices, and force it into a casing to make sausage. The syringe made that process faster and cleaner. Without it, you used your hands and lost more meat to spillage and spoilage. The people who packed that syringe had processed animals before. They knew what they were doing and they intended to keep doing it, somewhere cold enough that the meat would keep. Number 13, a small tin containing approximately 40 seeds identified by analysis as Mortgage Lifter tomato seeds. The name alone is worth pausing on. Mortgage Lifter is a variety of tomato developed in the 1930s by a radiator repairman in Logan, West Virginia, named Radiator Charlie. He spent 6 years crossing the largest tomato varieties he could find, selling the resulting plants for $1 each at a time when $1 was a serious sum of money, and paid off his $4,000 mortgage entirely from tomato sales. He then gave the seeds away for free. The name spread because the idea spread. A tomato plant that grows fruit large enough and flavorful enough to sell could help a family lift itself out of debt. Whoever packed those seeds understood that survival was not just about eating. It was about having something worth selling. If you are still watching at this point, leave a comment telling me which object surprises you most. I read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because the next 5 objects get significantly more interesting. Number 12. A straight razor in a bone handle case, with a small leather strop folded alongside it. In an era before disposable blades, a good straight razor maintained properly could last a lifetime. More importantly, a man who could shave himself and his neighbors cleanly was a man with a marketable skill in a cash-starved community. Depression-era photographs from Alaska's Matanuska Valley show men clean-shaven even in the depths of winter, even while building their first cabins in the mud. This was not vanity. This was identity. This was the refusal to look defeated even when the circumstances were defeating. The razor said, "I am still a man who takes care of himself. I am still a man worth taking care of." Number 11. A coil of number 9 galvanized wire, approximately 60 feet, with a pair of wire pliers. 60 feet of wire and a pair of pliers can build a chicken coop. They can repair a fence. They can rig a snare line for small game. They can hold together a broken axle long enough to get home from the back country. Wire was currency in the Depression-era homesteading communities of Alaska, traded for labor, for food, for the use of a neighbor's draft horse. The people who packed that coil understood that a homestead is a system, and systems break, and when a system breaks in Alaska in January, improvisation is not optional. Number 10. A small wooden box containing a complete set of dental tools, a mirror, 2 picks, a pair of extraction forceps, and a small bottle of oil of cloves. There was no dentist within 300 miles of most Matanuska Valley homesteads in 1935. Dental pain in the absence of treatment is incapacitating. A man who cannot work because his tooth is abscessed cannot feed his family. Oil of cloves is a natural analgesic that temporarily numbs dental pain. The extraction forceps allowed whoever owned that kit to pull a tooth that had gone too far. This was not amateur hour. This was triage medicine practiced by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And it saved lives. And it almost certainly saved at least one homesteader from an infection that, left untreated, would have spread to the jaw, and then to the bloodstream, and then to the grave. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Every single object in this crate weighs something. Every pound of weight carried on a boat or a truck or a horse-drawn wagon in 1935 was a pound that had to be paid for or justified or fought for. A family moving to Alaska in 1935 could not bring everything. They had to choose. What you see in this crate is not a random collection. It is a curated argument about what survival requires. It is a philosophy of starting over expressed in iron and leather and glass and wire. Each object chosen at the expense of something left behind. A photograph, a piece of furniture, a child's toy. These 20 objects are what someone decided mattered more than everything else. Number 9. A tin of Stockholm tar. This is a pine-based preservative used for treating wooden tools, fence posts, leather harness, and the hooves of work animals. In wet Alaskan conditions, untreated wood rots within a single season. A fence post that rots is a fence that fails. A fence that fails is livestock lost to the wilderness. Stockholm tar extends the life of wooden infrastructure dramatically, and in a homestead economy where every piece of infrastructure represents weeks of labor, extension of life is extension of survival. The tin was still nearly full when it was found. Whoever owned it had been careful with it, using only what was necessary, knowing it could not be easily replaced. Number 8. A hand-stitched quilt, found vacuum-compressed between 2 boards and still structurally intact despite 90 years in the ice. The quilt was made from at least 40 different fabric types, the analysis showed, ranging from flour sack cotton to what appeared to be wool suiting from a man's jacket. This was not a purchased quilt. This was a made quilt, sewn from scraps of clothing that had already lived their first lives as other things. The women of the Depression-era homestead communities quilted together through the winters, and their quilts were not decorative objects. They were thermal insulation in cabins that dropped to -40. They were the difference between sleeping and freezing. The quilt in that crate had been used, washed, repaired, and used again before it was packed. Someone loved it enough to bring it to the end of the world. Subscribe if you want to see our upcoming video on the tools found in a 1940s Appalachian time capsule. The stories get even wilder. Number 7. A small brass compass with a leather carrying case. Navigation in Alaska's interior wilderness in the 1930s was a skill that could not be bluffed. Men who got lost in the backcountry in winter died there. The compass was a simple object with a simple function. It told you which direction was north. But north in Alaska, in a spruce forest in a whiteout, is everything. It is the difference between finding your trap line and not finding it. Between reaching the river and circling in the woods until your matches run out. The compass in that crate was engraved on the back with the words, "Come home." 2 words. No name. Just a directive, cut into brass, by someone who understood the stakes. Number 6. A set of bone-handled sewing needles in a variety of gauges, along with approximately 200 yards of linen thread wound on a wooden spool. In 1935, a garment that tore was a garment that had to be mended, because a new garment was not affordable. Children grew, and their clothes had to be let out, and then taken in, and then passed down. Work gear wore through at the knees and elbows, and had to be patched with salvaged cloth. A woman with needles and strong thread was a woman who could keep her family clothed through years of hard use. The linen thread in that crate was still sound when it was tested in the laboratory. Linen does not rot easily. It was designed to last. So was the woman who packed it. Number 5. A double-bit axe head, no handle, wrapped in oiled burlap. The handle had been removed, almost certainly to save space and weight, with the understanding that a handle could be made from any straight-grained piece of local hardwood once the family arrived. The axe head itself was the irreplaceable part. Hand-forged, heat-treated, with an edge geometry that a skilled filer could maintain indefinitely. An axe in Alaska in 1935 was not one tool among many. It was the primary tool. It built the cabin. It split the firewood. It cleared the field. It butchered the moose. A man without an axe in the Alaskan wilderness was a man in serious trouble. A man with a good axe head and the knowledge to hang it properly was a man who had a fighting chance. Number 4. A hand-operated water pump cylinder and seal kit. Most homesteads drew their water from wells, springs, or nearby streams. A pump that failed in January in Alaska was a catastrophic problem. You could melt snow for water, but melting enough snow for a family and their livestock required constant fire, constant labor, and enormous fuel expenditure. A working pump, maintained with replacement seals and the knowledge to install them, was the difference between a homestead that functioned in winter and one that barely survived it. The seal kit in that crate contained 7 replacement seals of different sizes, suggesting the person who packed it had dealt with pump failure before and intended never to be caught unprepared again. Number 3. A set of homemade maps drawn in ink on oilskin, depicting what appears to be a river drainage system in the Matanuska Valley, with annotations marking locations of wild game, berry patches, fishing holes, and what the researcher interpreted as the locations of neighboring homesteads. These were not official maps. They were knowledge maps, built from experience, from walking the land, from talking to neighbors and indigenous guides and the kinds of people who know a country by living in it rather than surveying it. The annotations included notes like, Moose Cross here in October, and Good Spruce for cabin logs, Dry Ridge, and Betty and Carl, half-mile east, have the only crosscut saw. This was a social network encoded in oilskin, a map of not just the physical landscape, but the community of survival that had already begun to form. These maps were the most copied objects in the entire find. Every researcher on the team made a reproduction. Number 2. A set of medical reference cards, laminated in beeswax, covering the treatment of common injuries and illnesses without professional medical equipment. 14 cards, each covering a different emergency. Deep lacerations, broken bones, burns, hypothermia, appendicitis, difficult childbirth, infection management, and several others. The cards were written in clear, plain language, not medical jargon. They were designed to be read and followed by someone with no training, under stress, with whatever materials were at hand. The hypothermia card began. Strip the cold person of wet clothing immediately. Do not rub the skin. Warm the core first. Whoever wrote those cards understood that medical knowledge locked inside a professional's head is useless to a family 60 miles from the nearest doctor. They converted that knowledge into something transferable, something that could be read by candlelight in a frozen cabin by a frightened spouse who had never done this before and needed to be told exactly what to do. And now we come to number 1. The object that Dr. Hollis says she thinks about more than any other. The object that, when she describes it in lectures, makes the room go quiet. Number 1. A small cloth pouch containing 37 different varieties of seed, each variety wrapped in its own square of oilcloth, each square labeled in careful block letters with the name of the plant, and the year the seed was saved, and in several cases a brief note about growing conditions. Tomato, bean, squash, corn, turnip, carrot, beet, kale, parsnip. Potato starts wrapped in damp moss. Herb seeds, including dill, chamomile, and something the researchers initially could not identify that turned out to be a variety of medicinal valerian used historically as a sleep aid and anxiety treatment. This was not a commercial seed packet purchased at a hardware store. This was a seed library built over years, possibly decades, by someone who understood that seeds are time. A tomato variety saved through 3 bad drought years has drought resistance bred into it. A bean variety that survived the hardest winters your grandmother remembered has cold tolerance that no catalog variety can match. These were seeds that had been tested by the exact conditions that the person saving them was trying to survive. They were not generic. They were specific. They were shaped by history. 37 varieties, representing at minimum 37 seasons of careful harvest, 37 decisions to save instead of eat, 37 small acts of faith that there would be a next year worth planting for. Dr. Hollis points out that several of the varieties in that pouch no longer exist in any known seed bank. They were lost everywhere else. They survived only because someone packed them in oilcloth and put them in a crate, and carried them to Alaska and buried them, inadvertently, in the permafrost, where they waited 90 years for someone to find them. The seeds themselves are no longer viable. 90 years is beyond what even the most carefully stored seed can survive. But the DNA is there. Researchers have been able to sequence several of the varieties and are working to reconstruct them using modern techniques. If they succeed, plants that went extinct in the 1930s will grow again, not because of any grand institutional effort, because one person, whose name we still do not know, decided that these varieties were worth saving and packed them carefully and got on a boat to Alaska. That is what starting over looks like. Not dramatic, not heroic in any obvious way, just a cloth pouch and 37 small decisions that turned out to matter for 100 years and counting. Every single one of those 20 objects in that Alaskan crate carries the same message. You take the things that matter. You learn the skills that last. You build what you need from what you have. And you keep the seeds. Because the seeds are not just food. The seeds are the next year, and the year after that. And every year, you could not yet imagine when you sealed the crate and walked away from everything you used to be. These 20 objects found in Alaskan ice are not a museum exhibit. They are an instruction manual. And the question they ask you directly is this: if you had to pack a crate today, knowing you would have to start over somewhere hard and cold and unknown, what would you put in it? Tell me in the comments. I mean that. Tell me specifically, not just in general terms. Tell me the one object you would fight to bring. I will read every single answer, and in a future video, I will build a crate from your responses. Thank you for watching. If this video changed the way you think about even one of these objects, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.